if there's a murder, I need to be there before they touch the corpse, because or approach it too much, because a little bent twig or a footprint in the grass or disturbed leaves all means something to me. And then I come to the body and I look at the body, but I want to know what's underneath the body, what's around the body. And so, I mean, if it's a burial, I have to look at all the soil in the burial and be there with the archaeologist when they excavate it, so that, because a lot of evidence comes out. I was born in the Soham Valley, which is in between the valley of the Ebro and the Rumney, which is next to the Rhondda. So I'm from the mining valleys of South Wales. I didn't realise it, but I was brought up in the country, because our valley in particular was rural with the occasional coal mine. And we had the hills and lots of wildness around us, with wild horses and the sheep everywhere. And in our village, nobody could have a nice garden because the sheep were always in the garden. There were always sheep wandering up the road. They were everywhere. And in the winter, the horses used to come down on the village green to be fed. So, it was quite wild, really.
Where did your love for botany, plants come from?
The one thing I remember I was delighted with was getting a penknife, because we could dig things up. And I found out a lot on my own. But my grandmother used to take me for walks, and we used to look in the hedgerows and look for birds' nests and all sorts of things. And she'd show me what leaves you could eat, what was poisonous, what would hurt you, what wouldn't hurt you. So, I mean, she had a great knowledge of wildlife and the outside, and it just rubbed off, I suppose. And I've never, ever not been interested in wildlife, all sorts of wildlife, insects and worms and plants and flowers and everything.
One of the key aspects of your work as a forensic ecologist is the study of pollen. Tell me about how you came to study palynology.
I first learned about palynology as an undergraduate at King's College London, and we were introduced to them under the microscope, and we had to analyse them and so on. And when I saw these pollen grains, the one thing that struck me is how different they all are. But there are similarities with a lot of them. So trying to identify them is quite hard, because there are some that all look very similar, but they're different species. Others are quite different. You get to learn them. And people say, well, how do you remember them? Well, it's like learning your friends. I could never mistake you for that lady, and never mistake that lady for that lady. So you get to know the anatomy and the morphology. It's not as easy as that, actually. I mean, you're looking at sometimes at things a micron in size on the surface of the wall to differentiate between species and so on. So it is quite hard, but it's microscopy, if you like. I love microscopic things. And I loved working with fungi and bacteria.
Why?
Well, they're fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And they're everywhere, absolutely. I mean, do you realise how many bacteria are on you at this minute, or in you at this minute? And fungi, they're even in your brain.
How does your journey go from there to becoming a forensic ecologist?
When I was an undergraduate, I did botany, zoology, advanced biogeography, bacteriology, mycology, geology, all the ologies really. And although I was ostensibly a botanist, I was very lucky at King's, because I had a very, very wide interest, and there were lots of subjects I could study. And my best subject of all was parasitology. And I thought I might be a parasitologist, except that all the research involved in harming animals. So I couldn't do that. But I eventually ended up as a lecturer at King's, and I lectured in microbial ecology. That's the ecology of fungi and the ecology of bacteria. But I had the palynology as well. And after 18 years at King's, I went to University College. And the palynology I had under my belt, I applied in archaeology. Now, I was 16 years at University College working in archaeology. So I learned a lot of archaeology. And basically, What I was doing was reconstructing ancient environments from what I saw under the microscope. And it would bring a whole place alive. And you could see how people were living, what they were eating, and so on. That's what I was doing. Well, when I came into forensics, basically I didn't train as a forensic scientist. I just got a telephone call from a policeman. And they said, we've been to Kew Gardens and they can't help us, but they said you could help us. I said, well, how can I help you? And they said, well, we've got a murder. And we know that we have this car and we think it's been in this field, but we can't prove it. And so our boss thought that there could possibly be maize pollen on it because it was a maize field. Now that police officer was very intuitive, very clever. How many police officers would think that? So I said, well, I don't know, let's have a look. So I took the car to bits, analysed just about everything you could analyse in a car, and found that the footwells and the pedals were the most productive and very specific. And when I analysed those, I could see in my mind what I'd been seeing in archaeology. And this was a field edge, a field boundary, and an ancient hedge. So they said to me, well, would you come and look at the place? And when I got there, they said, we'll show you where it was. And I said, I'd love to test myself. Can I just tell you where it is? And we walked along the edge of the field, looking, no. And all of a sudden, I saw what I saw under the microscope. There it was. I said, this is where the body was. And they were utterly shocked, but so was I, because I didn't know we could do that. But when you think about it, I was reconstructing ancient environments, this gave me a lot more confidence for that work, because here I had proof, because you can't prove it in archaeology. And there it was, I could see it, and it was what I saw under my microscope. And that helped to get a conviction, and it was a Triad gang. It was a terrible murder.
Can you tell me a bit about what happened in the murder?
Well, it was a money laundering case, and it was a man who was given money by this gang, and he'd been asked to buy property. And instead of doing that, he spent the money. They didn't intend to kill him, apparently, but they hog-tied him and put him in the back of the vehicle. And he was a big man, and it collapsed his lungs and he died. Because hog-tying, you put the hands and legs behind the back and they lie on their chest, and his lungs collapsed and he died. Well, then they panicked and they said, oh, we'll go and dump the body in Wales. But they couldn't find Wales, and they ended up going north to Hertfordshire, and they saw this field, and they thought, of course, that it was a remote field. But so they put it in the ditch. Well, of course, it wasn't that remote. And they thought, oh, we've got to get rid of this body. So they set it on fire. Well, what happened is you can't get rid of a body like that at all. The farmer saw the smoke coming up. What's that in my ditch? Went across and found the body. It was fun doing it, because for what I have to do is eliminate places. I mean, yes, what I found in the car was just like this, but supposing there was someone else like it. So I had to go all the places that these people are likely to have been, and nothing matched. And I remember walking down an East London street with two police officers who tried not to look like police officers, but they looked like police officers. And me with my notebook going like this, writing down all the plants I saw. And all of a sudden they said, we've got to go. And I said, why? We're being watched. And we just had to go, because some of those things I've done is very dangerous.
Why did you continue to work with the police from
because
that point?
They asked me again and again and again and again and again. I mean, they'll have a murder or something, and they'll ring me up and say, we've got a case, can you help? Now, for me, if there's a murder, I need to be there before they touch the corpse, or approach it too much, because a little bent twig or a footprint in the grass or disturbed leaves all means something to me. Well, a lot of police officers, well, sometimes they don't realise that, and a lot of disturbance goes on. And then I come to the body and I look at the body, but I want to know what's underneath the body, what's around the body. And so, I mean, if it's a burial, I have to look at all the soil in the burial and be there with the archaeologist when they excavate it. So that, because a lot of evidence comes out, tiny little things that people don't notice.
What is it like when you're looking at a body? Are you trying to work out where you can find evidence?
Well, I sample it. When the pathologist takes the brain out, I go in and you've got a plate of bone there. It's called the cribriform plate, and it's full of holes. And that's where your olfactory nerves go up into your brain. Now, this is very convenient because when the brain comes out, I've just got this thin plate of bone that I can break through and get down into the bones here, which are called turbinates. And they're like coral reefs. They're very complicated. And they're covered in membranes because they warm the air, they trap particles and so on. And I flush them out because anything that's been breathed in will be on them, so I flush them out. And you can get a lot of information from what someone's breathed in. I would look at stains on the body, their fingernails, gut contents from vomit, feces. It all depends, really.
Wow, so you can really look at any part of the body and glean information.
Oh, yes.
Amazing.
Well, you have to. Anywhere that you can get evidence from, you look at.
And you've worked on a couple of high-profile cases, and one of them was the Soham girls' murder of Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells. Could you tell me a bit about your work on that?
In the first instance, I was brought in before the girls were found. The police were very good there. They got a team of experts together so that when they were found, we'd all be ready to move in. So I would be first in with the corpses. But the police couldn't, when they were found, the police couldn't understand how the perpetrator had actually got into the ditch where he'd put the girls, because there was a bed of stinging nettles about that high as far as the eye could see. And it looked undisturbed. So how did he hop over all these stinging nettles to take two bodies into the ditch? Well, when I walked up and down, of course, I saw a faint path. And I said, this is the approach path. And I could tell that because the nettles had been trodden, but they'd recovered and they'd come back up. So I showed them. And when I showed them the approach path, I found Jessica's hair on a twig. So Huntley had probably put on his shoulder, walked in, and her hair got caught on a twig. I went, so that found that path for them. So then they said, well, okay, but how long ago? Well, when I looked at the nettles, I got them out, put them on paper. And when you have a plant, most plants, nearly all plants, they are hormonally controlled from the tip. And the hormones are flowing back and control the growth of the plant. If you destroy that tip or you interrupt it, the flow is interrupted, then all these little side shoots become shoots on their own with their own controlling tips with hormones. And we'd got all these side shoots that had grown up. And by looking at the number of places where leaves came up, they're called nodes, on these little side shoots, I was able, from personal experience, to say it's about 2 weeks. But I went away and did a Mickey Mouse experiment. It can't be called a scientific experiment because you can't replicate all the conditions. But would you believe, after 13 and a half days, stopped the experiment because the nettles had grown exactly the same after trampling them and watching them and so on. And would you believe the girls had gone, from the time they'd gone missing to the time they were found, was exactly 13 and a half days. Now, I didn't say 13 and a half days, but the nettles from our little experiment showed 13 and a half days. Yeah. But after that, of course, I looked at Huntley's footwear and clothing and car, and there was no doubt about it that he'd been there twice. He had 2 petrol cans because he burnt the bodies, and he'd put the petrol cans on the verge. And it was quite a job to get these petrol cans from the other forensic scientists because there's nothing on them. And I got full profiles of the crime scene on them because they're charged particles and plastic is charged and boom, nylon stockings are fabulous. The pollen will really go onto it on most of your clothing because you're generating electricity all the time, and the pollen will jump on you. And so that's how I got that. So I could show that he'd been there twice.
And what was it like testifying in court with Ian Huntley there? Can you tell me about that experience?
Well, the Old Bailey's never nice. I think every forensic scientist that goes to court, that is the most difficult part of any part of the work. You go down, you're in the open part with all the marble halls and all the rest of it. You go behind a black curtain and there you are. And it's the world in front of you. You've got all the press there, the public gallery, all the barristers, the jury, And it's quite daunting. It's very daunting. And you've got to have your wits about you, because the prosecuting barrister in a prosecution case is your friend because he will ask all the right questions. The defence barrister asks all the awkward questions and tries to trip you up and tries to diminish you and tries to do all sorts of things. It's very hard, yeah. Nobody likes it, but I've coped so far.
Another high-profile case that you worked on was the Millie Dowler case. What was the investigation like for that?
The skull was lying there, and they said, how long has she been there? I lifted it up, put it down, and I said, since day one. Because she disappeared in March, and this was now September. Underneath the body, the leaf litter was last year's, not this year's. Also, the plants that the skull had been laid on had grown like that. Not only that, all the insects and sluggy things and all creepy crawlies and things were a natural woodland fauna. All the ones associated with decomposition had gone because she was decomposed. So we're now back to the woodland community. And she disappeared in March, and she'd been laying there in March. So I would have thought she'd been there since day one, and of course she was.
How do you feel working on these high-profile cases? Does it feel different to the other crimes that you help solve in any way?
Well, there's a lot more pressure from the police, really, because they're very, very anxious to have answers, and they want the answers yesterday, It's a lot of pressure like that. And the high-profile ones are not always the most interesting, Ones you've never heard of, scientifically, are sometimes far more interesting.
What is the most interesting case you've ever worked on?
Well, each one has got something, you see, of interest, so it's really difficult. I mean, the Ipswich sex workers was interesting because there were 5 corpses. There was 5 lots of things to find out, and that was interesting. For example, I found out from the first corpse that you continue to suntan 18 hours after death.
How did you discover that?
Well, because she had a sycamore leaf on her leg. When I took it off, there was a white sycamore leaf. So tanning had continued.
You have revisited training throughout your career, and one of the things I was interested in asking you about was the body farm. What is a body farm, and why did you go to a body farm?
There are now 12 in America. There was only one when I went there in Tennessee. There's one in Canada, there's one in Australia, and they're just starting up one in the Netherlands, but not quite like the others. And this one was set up by Bill Bass, who was an anthropologist, and the police used to go to him and say, tell us how long this person has been dead. And he said to them, look, I can't, until I've got some evidence, I just don't know. So he said, if you give me some land and I can put bodies on it and watch them, I might be able to help. And that's what happened. And they gave him about an acre. And basically they lay the bodies out in all sorts of conditions and they just see what happens. What flies come in, what fungi come in, how long does it take for someone with this medication to rot? What fabrics rot? They put them in water, tanks of water. Is it different in water? They might stick one in a car. How long does it take for it to decompose in a car? Is it different in a car from outside? They bury some. I mean, they'll try everything and then they watch what happens. What is interesting is that the main contributors are middle-aged to old-age white men. And they've usually got pacemakers and are on drugs and all the rest of it. You very rarely get women. You virtually never get children. You don't get many Hispanics, and you get virtually no black people. So it's a relatively select sample.
So you work in exoneration cases as well. How does it feel to work on a case that's, proving that somebody's not guilty of a crime that they may have been prosecuted?
Well, that actually is particularly satisfying because it's awful to think that an innocent person would go to prison. Because whatever I do, it has implications. And so you have to be very careful, very, very thorough. You can't make any glib statements. You really have to be very careful. There's a case of a baby that they accused the mother of trying to kill it because this baby was taken into hospital very poorly. It kept going back and forth to hospital, and she vomited these little black dots into a napkin, and it got thrown away. The next time it vomited, they were kept, but it was put in a fridge, and that was lost. But she vomited a third time, and this time someone kept them, sent them to the Forensic Science Service. It did all sorts of complicated chemistry, and it just came out as carbon, nitrogen, all the usual things. So they gave them to me, and they said, we think these are poppy seeds because the father's a baker, and we think the mother's putting poppy seeds in. They weren't poppy seeds, I could see that. But they could have been fungal bodies that I didn't recognise. So I went to Kew, to the Mycological Institute, well, it's the Mycological Institute, I suppose, which was at Kew, and asked the mycologist there, do you think this is fungal in origin? And they said, don't think so. And I didn't think so either. But there was the expert, you see. And while I was looking at these things, I noticed there was a red halo around these black dots. And of course, milk has got a lot of fat in it. So I realised that whatever was in these little black dots was fat soluble. So I put some in water, nothing came out. Put some in fat, the red stuff came out. And I realised they weren't biological, they had no structure. They were just absolutely little round spherical things. And I was trying to rack my brains to think what it was that looked like that. And the only thing I could think of was, you know, when you have time-release capsules and there are lots of little bubbles of drug inside, and that's what it was. And when I went back to the police, they went back to the hospital, and what was so stupid was that one doctor came forward, oh yes, I prescribed this anti-reflux drug for the baby, and that's what it is. That doctor knew, another doctor didn't. A nurse didn't know. They hadn't told the police. It was all miscommunication. Now, that poor mother could have been charged with all sorts of things. When they investigated the baby further, it had brittle bone disease. They thought she had Munchausen by proxy syndrome, and she was really making her baby ill. And the poor woman wasn't. You know, it's interesting, things like that, you see.
Can you tell me a bit about any of the cases that have stayed with you over your career?
One was a 22-year-old prostitute in Norwich, and her body was found in a very pretty woodland. And the police wanted to know how long she'd been dead and where she had been before she was killed. So I went to the mortuary, I washed her hair, did all the usual things, washed her clothes, looked at her clothes, analysed her clothing, everything from her I could. And was very obvious. Oh, she had the woodland on her, there's no doubt about that. She'd been there for some time, but she had another place on her, and it was very distinctive. And I said, she wasn't killed here, she was killed somewhere else. And I said, I think she's been very close or in a pond, very close to a honeysuckle, and around is mixed woodland. Well, the police looked for everywhere where there were ponds, and they found a place which was a fish farm, and it was a number of miles away. And when I went there, all the trees that I'd found associated, they were there, there were trees there. But I said, oh, there was a house, a sort of dwelling there. I said, all we need now is a big honeysuckle. We walked around the back of the house. There was a huge honeysuckle hanging over a balcony, and there was the pond. And it looked as though she'd been laid, they'd dredged the pond, and she'd probably been laid on the dredgings because I got all these aquatic indicators out and the honeysuckle. Well, that's weird. You don't get aquatic indicators with honeysuckle and trees. It was very, very specific. So I was able to find the place that she'd been killed for them, and that led them to suspects and so on.
Amazing. And why did that case and that lady stick with you so much?
I felt sorry for the girl. I mean, she's one of the few I've cried over, actually, because she was emaciated, she smelt a bit, she had 3 children, she was a prostitute because she didn't want to give her children up. She had to support her habit because she was forced to be a drug addict. She was made to be a drug addict, apparently. And she had to support her pimp. And she was in with evil people. And when I looked at this girl and I thought about what she was putting up with and her background, it upset me deeply. Death never upsets me. It's the thought of what she went through. It really upset me, actually. And that was one that stuck with me.
How long have you been a forensic ecologist, Patricia?
30 years.
And over the course of your 30-year career, how many cases have you worked on, do you think?
I honestly don't know, but it's got to be 300 or more. Yeah. I've got cabinets full of case histories.
What are you proudest of your career? Is there a moment or a case or something that you are most proud of?
I don't think proud is the word. I tell you what I am proud of is that an academic training has been applied. One can apply something that seems highly academic and you can apply it to a real life scenario that's important. That is very satisfying and I'm quite proud of that.
Why are you proud of that?
Well, because a lot of academics are looked on as being irrelevant, or you're learning Anglo-Saxon. Oh, yeah. But, they're very important people. You're learning Latin. Oh, It's important.
Your work's been compared, or somebody's compared you and the kind of way that you think to Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, they have.
How do you feel about that comparison?
Well, I think that's quite flattering, actually. I like that because I think it's true in a way, because I did tell a story recently where a police officer came to my house and he sat there having a cup of tea. And the thing that struck me about him was he was a rugby player and he had 2 cats. One was Ginger and one was Tortoiseshell. And when I told him this, he freaked out and he said, well, how do you know? Well, of course, his stature, his physique. Also, he had skag trousers, all these little pulls on his trousers. And there was ginger cat hair and there was tortoiseshell cat hair. And I know that most gingers are toms, are males, and most tortoiseshells are females. Just put 2 and 2 together. And I said this to him. And it was as though he thought I was a clairvoyant. And no, it's not. It's just looking for evidence. And I do that to a lot of people, actually. It's putting 2 and 2 together, or 3 and 4 together, and 5, 6, 7, and 8 together, and bring it together, and all these different little facets, and making a picture, making a story, making a scenario. It's bringing together of fragments of information, and putting them together in a picture. Like a jigsaw puzzle with some of the pieces missing, perhaps, or some with the wrong pieces in, but you can still see the picture. It's like that.
In this case, there was pots and pans on the top of the cooker, and you kind of think to yourself, they just haven't done their washing up. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. But then when you looked at the material in the frying pan, it was like, wow, that doesn't look like normal food, And anyway, it turned out that, yeah, it was brain.